So today's first panel, we start with the crisis that the sector is talking about and our response to that. We know I had a computer already when I was quite young in the 90s. And I know that in computers, pressing the reset button simply restarts the same system, together with its own, all the same processes, the same glitches, the same flaws. A reset is not a reform in itself. It's not an upgrade. It's simply a restart. And one can only press the button so many times before it eventually breaks. Today, the humanitarian sector finds itself pressing that button again. After decades of reforms, compacts, coordination frameworks, we once again are at crossroads, or maybe a better metaphor would be a roundabout, trying to navigate the record levels of need with the lowest levels of funding. So there's a bit of an infographic to contextualize the discussion ahead. The global humanitarian funding needs, roughly $44–45 billion this year. Only a quarter of that has been funded. The funding drop over the years is quite significant when you contrast that to the humanitarian needs, which have been rising, while the funding has been going down for, as I said also in the opening words, not really only this year, but already beforehand. At the same time, cash assistance, which was also part of the global grant bargain, is going down after having peaked in 2022. And also the localization pledge made at grant bargain, as part of the grant bargain, of 25% of funding to local actors is in reality only at a fraction of this. So against this backdrop, we are in the middle of the UN 80 reform and the humanitarian reset, a process proposing structural consolidation, efficiency gains, and even a reduction of UN staff. But beyond budget lines and restructuring, the key question remains, what should truly be at the core of this reset? What kind of humanitarian system do we want and need, and also who will be shaping that? And that's what we will explore today. To help unpack these questions, we have a truly distinguished panel representing different perspectives of the humanitarian ecosystem, from the UN, from the NGOs, and from the donors. So ladies first, Mervat Shelbaya, on my left hand, is the head of the Interagency Standing Committee, Secretariat. Mervat has over 2 decades of experience across UN system, from OCHA to WFP, and has played a central role, deputy chief of the 2016 World Humanitarian Summit that birthed the Grand Bargain. Today, she leads the Interagency Standing Committee Secretariat, the system's main coordination platform bringing together UN agencies, NGOs, and the Red Cross Red Crescent movement to strengthen collective action in crisis. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks. Thanks, Eero.
Second, Reshma Adatia, Director of Engagement at ICVA, the International Council of Voluntary Agencies, representing a network of 185 humanitarian NGOs worldwide. ICVA is also a member of the Interagency Standing Committee. Reshma combines policy, operational, and advocacy experience, having previously worked with Médecins Sans Frontières in crises from Yemen and Iraq to Sri Lanka and Sudan. She's a strong voice for locally led responses, equity in humanitarian leadership, and bridging the gap between global policy and frontline realities. Welcome.
Thank you.
And third, Hans Taas, Deputy Director General and Chief Operations Officer of DG ECHO, the European Commission's Directorate General for Civil Protection and Humanitarian Aid. Hans has led ECHO's Emergency Response Unit and Civil Protection Policy Unit, and before that worked on post-war restitution in both Bosnia and Kosovo. Now overseeing one of the largest humanitarian donor portfolios in the world, he's well placed to speak on what efficiency, reform, and partnership mean from a donor's perspective. Welcome.
Thank you.
So we will begin with short scene-setting statements from each of our panelists. And to start us off, I'll invite each of you to answer a simple-sounding question, which may be not so. So from your point of view, what is or should be at the core of humanitarian reset? And let's start from Mervat.
Many thanks, Eero, and truly, truly a pleasure to be with you today. This is my first visit to Estonia, and what a beautiful place and what a beautiful setting. And really huge thanks to you, Eero, for bringing us together, and for the Estonian Refugee Council for hosting this important meeting. And it's not just an important meeting standalone, but it comes at a critical time, not just for the humanitarian system. And again, a reminder, the humanitarian system, of course, goes beyond the UN. And I know that I'll be here speaking largely about the UN, but I also want to speak about the broader community, given the membership of the Interagency Standing Committee. But it's also a critical juncture and a milestone for humanitarian action as a whole. So at the core of the humanitarian reset, it will be difficult and it will be a failure, if I can be provocative, to kickstart to talk about the reset without talking about communities. So the reset ultimately is about how the system, all stakeholders in the system, starting with local actors, governments that are ultimately responsible, the primary responsible entities to respond and protect to the needs of communities in crisis. UN agencies, INGOs, local NGOs, as well as member states and donors. It's our primary responsibility to ensure that we are in a better position to service and protect communities affected by crisis. That ultimately translates to the need to respond to their expressed needs, not our assumption of what their needs are, not based on what we're able to provide, but how we can redesign the system and reconfigure the system to ensure that we are in a better place to respond to their expressed needs. That ultimately also goes towards the need to move decision-making power and resources closer to communities. So this has to be the litmus test for the success or the failure of any reform, including the humanitarian reset. And it has to be the lens and the compass by which we need to think about how we behave, our mindset, how we act, how we program, to make sure that ultimately people indeed are at the center. It doesn't mean that the system has not done this over the past decades. It has, and if it had not been for the system that we're all part of, millions of lives would be lost, millions of lives would be not protected. So it's important to recognize the progress that has happened over the years as a result of this collective ability of the system to respond to needs and on the ground as a result of course, conflict and climate crisis and so on. But at the same time, the reason why we have the reset today is because the world has changed, and we've all recognized it, we all see it, whether it's as a result of challenges to the multilateral system, whether that's a result of geopolitics that is really putting a lot of strain on the system. And you've all heard, if you haven't, of course, Under Secretary General Tom Fletcher, the Emergency Relief Coordinator, who has said that the system is overstretched, under-resourced, and under attack. Under attack with disregard, serious and blatant disregard for international human rights law and IHL, humanitarian workers and civilians and infrastructure being under attack as well, overstretched as a result of the challenges that we have faced over the years as a result of failures of mediation and conflict prevention, as a result of challenges over the years being present in countries in protracted settings for many, many years, as a result of our inability as a system to respond to and address the root causes of conflict and vulnerability. and the need for more development actors, of course, to be present in these contexts so that we can get out of the way as humanitarians. Ultimately, the goal is to get out of the business of humanitarian action and not have to respond to these needs. And the icing over the cake, if I can say so, is these significant budget constraints and financial constraints that we're facing as a system, which is not just having an impact on the number of staff in humanitarian organizations, but it's having direct impact on the communities that we are there to serve. And I'll have the opportunity to speak to that in a minute. So ultimately, at the core of the reset, it's about communities, how we close the gap between supply, what we're able to supply, but more importantly, what are communities demanding of us, which is protection, dignity, and in many cases, if you look around the world, as you look at perception surveys, it's education, it's livelihood. So how can we indeed close this gap between supply and demand? But we can't do it alone as a system. We need member states, we need donors, we need the political will to drive the required changes that we are all aspiring for. Thanks.
Thank you. And then moving on, the same question to Reshma.
Thank you very much, and thank you as well for the invitation. It's also my first time in Estonia, and it's gray but beautiful. So thanks very much for having me. I'm going to build a little bit on what Mervat said, but I would like to say, when we're talking about the reset, it is easy to think of it as another reform moment because that's our default, isn't it? One more round of technical fixes to a system under strain. But this time it does feel different. It feels different because the reset is happening not just because we can't keep up with the scale of need, but because people across the sector, donors, UN, NGOs, communities, are asking whether the system as it stands still deserves their trust. And I just want you to think about that. Do they want us? Do they trust us? Do we deserve that? Over the past year, for me, that question has become quite sharp. We've seen reduced funding, rising political pressure, and humanitarian crises that are more protracted, but less prioritized. At the same time, we have the Grand Bargain Efficiency Caucus, which has called for reforms that are tangible, measurable, and designed to rebuild confidence. So much of the debate right now focuses on numbers. Due diligence, transaction costs, pooled funds. But from my perspective, the deeper issue isn't about efficiency, it's about relevance. Relevance is the new accountability. A system that loses its relevance to affected people can't claim to be accountable, no matter how good the spreadsheets look. The Grand Bargain Joint Statement put it clearly. Efficiency is not about cost cutting. It's about building a system that earns and keeps trust. And trust, as we see daily across ICVA's 185 members, is built not in headquarters, but in spaces where decisions meet reality, where compliance tools either enable or constrain delivery, where partnership agreements either empower or extract. ICVA just recently produced a complementarity paper, and in it we argue that efficiency without equity isn't efficiency at all. If risk is pushed down the chain while control stays at the top, what looks efficient on paper is corrosive in practice. So the question for all of us isn't how much we can save, but what kind of system do we want to sustain? Complementarity is not coordination by another name. It's cooperation by design. No single actor can meet today's challenges alone. And not NGOs, not the UN, not donors, not member states. Local NGOs bring legitimacy and access. International agencies bring logistics and leverage. Diaspora networks, of which there are many in Eastern Europe, bring knowledge and trust. Each fills a different gap, and the system's strength lies in how well we connect those capacities, not how tightly we control them. But funding is a problem, right? Complementarity only works when funding allows it. A 30% reduction in donor budgets can feel like a 60% collapse by the time it reaches frontline partners. Each layer keeps a share for its own risk. If we want a sustainable reset, we must stop confusing risk transfer with risk management. Donors and international actors must invest in shared compliance systems, flexible instruments, predictable funding that makes partnerships possible and not precarious. For NGOs, the challenge is not just to ask for space, but to use it differently through transparency, collaboration, and humility. We need to be clear where international structures add value and where they need to step back. A smaller system can still be a strong one, especially if it stays human. The reset for me, and I'll end here, is not a narrowing of ambition. It's a rebalancing of power and responsibility. If we can build a system that is more connected to people, more predictable in its support, and more honest about its limits, then efficiency can finally mean not just doing more with less, but doing better with more trust.
Thank you, Reshma. And the same question to Hans. So what is the reset from donor perspective?
Thank you very much, Eero, and good morning, everybody. And thank you very much to the Ministry and to the Estonian Refugee Council for the invitation and for bringing us together here. I'm very, very happy to be here, and a good opening question indeed. I think from a donor perspective, I would want to emphasize, first of all, that it is indeed a pivotal moment for the humanitarian aid community, and sort of bearing in mind what the Director General said earlier, never waste a good crisis. I think that applies more today than ever before. The crisis is very severe and it's very serious. Needs increasing very rapidly, funding going down, not just from the US, but from others as well. And all of that in a context of blatant disrespect for international humanitarian law. So the humanitarian system is clearly overstretched. It is clearly underfunded. But there is something even deeper behind that funding situation. And that is really about the principles of independence, neutrality, humanity, and the values of multilateralism being questioned and being challenged. The world is changing. It's not just a funding crisis. It's a fundamental crisis of values and principles. And so we need to think hard within that context, sort of how we're going to move forward. The EU has thought long and hard about this. We are making a very conscious, deliberate, and positive choice to continue to support the humanitarian aid system. We are steadfast in our commitment to put money into this and to invest in continued principled approaches to humanitarian aid, because we think that is the right thing to do, and because we think it will actually serve our own interest in the long term. So we have a deep conviction and a deep belief in that approach, and we think that approach needs to be multilateral, and it needs to be based on needs, and starting from the community certainly makes good sense, and it needs to be anchored in principles. But in return for that commitment, we do want to see genuine change in the system, while protecting the core of it, the principles, the values behind it. We need to really redesign now how the community works, how we work together, how we function. It is about putting more focus in the system. It needs to become more focused. We need to have a better understanding, better data collection systems, better understanding of the needs, better assessment of the needs. We need to have joined up assessments of the needs. We need stronger local leadership. We fully agree with that. It is important that we put the local actors first. Not always easy from a donor perspective. I will recognize that fully. And there's certainly also work to be done on our side on this. But that is clearly the direction of travel, and we all need to support it. More cash, more efficiency in the system. And you'll hear me talk more about efficiency later on in this conversation, because obviously that is a part that we as donors care particularly about. It pains me to see so much fragmentation and division still in the system. I mean, we need to become much more joined up, and I think we can do that if we work together. Coordination, we talk a lot about coordination. We have a lot of coordination meetings, but are we really fully, genuinely coordinated today? Question mark, and I'll leave the question unanswered for now. So what it boils down to, in my very personal view, is that we need to see a much more collaborative, a much more cooperative approach. We need to get rid of the silos. We need to get rid of the turf. And we need to really go towards a truly joined up, integrated system. I'll just illustrate that very briefly, if I may. I was in Myanmar 2 weeks ago. We traveled along the country, met with the regime, met with all of the partners, both the UN side and the NGOs. And obviously there's a lot of good work being done by many of the partners in an extremely challenging and difficult context there. But it was very clear that, first of all, nobody seems to be in crisis mode. I mean, everybody is trying to apply the same business model, the same approach to a situation where the humanitarian response plan in Myanmar is funded at a level of 13%. It's the second lowest in the world. To me, that would mean that you have to switch to crisis mode. You have to start looking at doing things differently. And I really felt that that was not yet the case. And it's still very much everybody working on their own plans. And in a situation where your funding is at the level of 13%, I think the way forward is to bring things together and see who can do what, and to try and come towards a really integrated approach. So all of that just to say that UN80 and the reset are a unique opportunity. As donors, or as EU, we very much want to help shape that sort of reform. We are coming up with a Commission communication that is a policy document in which we will set out our vision sort of for the future of humanitarian aid. That will be early next year only, so it's not ideal in terms of timing. But we're working on it, and it's something, but already in the meantime, we really want to be part of this. And we're really hoping that the reset ultimately will not be a step back. This should not be about rolling back on things we have agreed upon in the past, on localization, on cash, on gender, on climate, but it really needs to be a step forward. It all needs to become lighter, more efficient, more effective, more performant. Thank you.
Thank you all for the opening remarks. There's a lot to unpack here from already what you already have said. But maybe let's go back to Mervat, and something Hans just mentioned is the change that is also essentially necessary. You know, the 13% in Myanmar shows that we need the system itself internally to do something different. So are we on this pathway right now with UN in particular?
So I would say we're heading in the right direction, but we're far from where we need to be. But just also, like, with the caveat that the reset was launched earlier this year, and in your introduction, Eero, you mentioned that, of course, change is never easy. There is natural resistance when you're operating or working in organizations that have entrenched agendas and have also been performing in a certain way for so many years. But it doesn't mean that change is not possible, and it doesn't mean that change is not already underway. And the reason why this is the case, unlike you were mentioning, is this reform a real reform, or is it a reset? How different is it from previous reforms? And it's important to note that previous reforms have worked to a certain extent. I mean, 2005, of course, the humanitarian reform was, as a result, every single reform, there's a trigger that pushes the system to work differently and do things differently. So in 2005, the humanitarian reform, that was the cluster reform, and it was as a result of the tsunami, it was as a result of the Darfur crisis and the recognition that we needed to do more as a system to minimize or avoid duplication, to do more in terms of leadership, and that is the reason why the cluster system was created. That's why the role of the humanitarian coordinator was created. That's why the Central Emergency Response Fund was also created. Likewise, also with the transformative agenda in 2011, 2012, that was triggered by also recognizing that we needed to do better in mega crises, such as the Haiti earthquake and the Pakistan floods. And from there, we moved towards a system that does more in terms of interagency needs assessment. So I hear you that we need to do more joined up and better needs assessment. But remember also where we were and where we're going. Absolutely. So progress is happening. But given the fact that we are in the, again, and I'm being provocative for a reason by saying business, given the fact that we are in the business of saving lives and reducing suffering, it is important for us to be the toughest on ourselves. So when we talk about reform, we have to continuously evolve, recognizing that what we're doing for communities affected by crisis, yes, we're doing a lot, but it will never be enough. It will never be enough. And that's why this drive and the push to evolve and adapt, to be able to address fundamental issues about lives protected and reducing suffering is a serious endeavor, and we can never take it, of course, lightly. The reason why the reform today, my sense from where I sit, and again, to your point, Reshma, I feel that we have a better chance in terms of fulfilling or addressing some of the big commitments that we made at the World Humanitarian Summit in 2016. I would say that this is where we haven't made the shifts that we were hoping to make post-World Humanitarian Summit in 2016. Even with the Grand Bargain, and as you mentioned, the Grand Bargain is one of the byproducts of the World Humanitarian Summit. It's not the only one. There were many others. There were many other big commitments that came out of the World Humanitarian Summit. And again, I was privileged, as you mentioned, Eero, to be really at the heart of this, not just the summit, but the 2.5 years of consultations where we made it a point that the drive for change and the demands for change were not dictated at the global level, even with a lot of pushback from many member states as to what is the summit, why is it not an intergovernmental process, but we made it a point to start the consultations and be dictated by what communities were saying. Thousands of consultations and dialogues and engagements with communities at the operational level and on the grounds level. Thousands of consultations with local NGOs, and I would say it's the first that we've ever done that. This was between 2013 and 2016, and it is from there that we talked about the importance of localization. So over 10 years ago that we've been talking about localization, and we're not where we need to be. Progress, absolutely, incremental progress, but not at the catalytic level that we were hoping we would see. But today we have no choice but to push for these changes. We have no choice for a number of reasons. First of all, and I'm happy to see that, and maybe also just a small, footnote. Tom Fletcher, the Undersecretary General, who is also the Emergency Relief Coordinator, he holds quarterly dialogues with local NGO representatives every quarter to hold him to account and to hold the system to account. Are the changes that you're committing through the reset, are they taking place or not? Are you fulfilling or addressing the gap between global commitments and what we're seeing on the ground level? And it's a tough conversation. It's a really, really tough conversation. But again, that's one way of demonstrating that this change and this reform is necessary. There is much stronger will amongst the IASC members than before for this change to happen. And I would say, unfortunately, a big part of it is catalyzed as a result of these significant financial cuts and budget cuts that we're all experiencing. So we have to do things differently. Last week, we were in New York for the Interagency Standing Committee Principals meeting. So this is basically the heads of the key or the primary global humanitarian organizations across the globe. Eero, you mentioned it. It's the UN agencies, it's the NGO representatives, including, of course, ICVA, SCHR, Interaction, Save the Children, Oxfam, CARE, and others. The Red Cross, the IFRC, as well as the ICRC, the World Bank, and others. This is the composition or the membership of the Interagency Standing Committee. And one of the issues that we're talking about is absolutely we're all behind the reset. There are issues that are within our sphere of influence as IASC members, as UN, NGOs, and others, to drive the required changes, including around localization, including around efficiencies, including around simplifying coordination structures, including around doing more around joint appeals and synchronizing our appeals so that we're not competing, while also recognizing that there's a lot also more that needs to be done from the member states and specifically the donor side. Because efficiencies in particular, yes, as I said, there's a lot that we can do as a system, but the primary incentive for any change ultimately is funding. And donors fund the system as it is. So as there is a push and the importance, of course, of UN agencies and NGOs and the larger stakeholder to be efficient, it is equally important for member states and donors to be coordinated to drive the changes that we all want to see. It's a primary incentive. It's political will, as well as also putting the right incentives in place to drive the changes as fast as they need to happen because of the crisis that we're facing at the moment. So I can go on, and I'm not sure if I'm over my time or not, but so just to say, today's environment is very different than it was a decade ago, especially post-World Humanitarian Summit. I'm already seeing the shifts in terms of even the quality of the conversations that are happening at the Interagency Standing Committee. In the meeting last week, they were talking about, yes, complementarity, and also recognizing that some of the organizations that are around the table will no longer exist. They will cease to exist because of the funding crunch that we are facing. So the question to the group was, do we allow this to happen organically, which may result in a system and a group of organizations that might not be the best place to respond depending on context? Or do we rise to the occasion and really look at context by context? Where do we need to exist? Where do we not need to be present? Who's best placed to respond? And who is best placed not to respond in a specific context? So you cannot make the general rule at the global level that, okay, well, these are the organizations that will cease to exist. But at the operational level, every context is different. Every context is different, and that's how the system is really looking at how we can adapt to make sure that in terms of footprint, in terms of presence, we are doing it hand in hand with local actors and taking into account who's best placed to respond to communities' expressed needs.
Very quick follow-up, and then I'll move on. Will we see mergers of UN agencies in the next few years in the framework of the UN80 reform?
Yes, so I would hope so, but at the same time, that's also another area that is not within the sphere of influence of agencies. This is a member state decision. So member states have to drive these fundamental decisions to ensure that we are more efficient in terms of mergers. And again, you've all seen the UN80 report. There are proposals from the Secretary General about possible mergers. And again, this is food for thought and a push and ideas for member states to think about how these potential mergers can happen. But even if the mergers don't happen overnight, which I don't suspect they will happen overnight, already as a result of the UN80 process, they are looking at ways to ensure that they streamline efforts, integrate work to look at how there can be more efficiencies, especially around common services. So sharing like joint premises, supply chain and procurement, streamlining of efforts, fleet management, amongst other areas to ensure that we're more efficient, even if the mergers don't happen overnight. But again, that's a member state decision. We need that push from member states.
Thank you. Reshma, listening to all of that and reading and being also partially in the room when these discussions take place, then are we reforming the system as a whole, or are we reforming UN as part of the system? You know, what do you feel is the NGO's role in this reset, and is it sufficient?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm probably not going to make many friends with my response, so I'll apologize in advance. The reality is progress is happening, but it is so slow, so slow. I mean, I remember at the World Humanitarian Congress 10 years ago, you know, being the World Humanitarian Summit, 10 years ago, being at, you know, the ending sort of rallying cry was as local as possible, as international as necessary, and we're still using the same rallying cry because very little has changed, despite masses of commitments and promises towards localization. The fact is, and I'll be really blunt, the NGOs are moving faster than the UN system. And that's for a variety of reasons, right? I think Mervat has mentioned some of them, including the reality that the UN system is member state driven, it's member state led, and until member states sort of get it together to push, it's not going to happen. Whereas NGOs don't have that same sense of needing to sort of navigate these masses of bureaucracy. I would also agree that the quality of conversation is increasing, not just within the IASC, but in the system as a whole. But let's be blunt, conversations aren't action, right? They're just more conversations, and we've had them for decades. And communities will say that, you know, everybody talks, and that's great, but then where do we see what the impact is? So in terms of engagement in the process, yes, NGOs have been present. I would argue that they're not as included as they should be. I think there's a difference between being in the room and shaping discussion. In some spaces, engagement has been genuine, consultations, regional dialogues. In others, it's been tokenistic, information shared after decisions are made, and that's particularly happening at the operational level, and particularly with local and national actors. From my perspective, the reset is not going to succeed if it's designed from the top. NGOs, especially national actors, are not only beneficiaries of the reform, but they have to be co-owners of it. We're calling for structured participation where NGO networks help shape and not simply validate reform decisions. We need to build with and not for those who deliver change and those who receive assistance, because that's the only path towards relevance.
Thank you. And Mervat, you had a quick reaction.
Yes, if you manage. And I couldn't agree more with most of what you mentioned, Reshma, but maybe to play a bit of a devil's advocate. Actually, I'll start with what I agree with, which is I couldn't agree more with the fact that changes have to happen from the operation level upwards. And for colleagues to be aware, and that was one of the conclusions of the last week's IASC meeting, is that we're rolling out a scorecard so that for every single context, we'll be able to measure whether there is progress happening in a number of, again, a handful, again, talking about focus, because you were mentioning about focus, and I couldn't agree with you more. You would have seen, or you will see the roadmap for the reset. It's like 30 different work streams. Of course, we have to be as inclusive as possible of all the areas that we need to work on, but at the same time, fully recognizing that for the reset to work, there are a handful of areas that we need to make sure that we demonstrate and see results changing at the operation level. And you mentioned some of them, also Eero, whether it's around scaling up multi-purpose cash, whether it's around the co-leadership of local actors, but also direct funding to local actors, amongst a whole suite of other areas. This scorecard is going to give us a visual of where there are successes and celebrating them and really making sure that they're scaled up, looking at where there is no success or there's no progress, and zooming in, and that's where the global level comes in, to see why aren't these shifts happening? Is there a good reason? Like, for instance, in some contexts, you cannot scale cash. You can't, because it's, governments do not agree with it, or the infrastructure does not permit for cash to be scaled up. So if there is a good reason for some of these areas not progressing, then it is understandable. But every country team will be expected to explain why the default of cash and localization and more efficiencies is not taking place. So keep an eye out on the scorecard, because it's more than just the headlines at the global level, and also recognizing that, again, contexts matter, and every context is different. And then, in terms of the, where I want to, maybe challenge you a little bit, Reshma, is around. Yes, I mean, I take it that the UN is big. It's bureaucratic. Change takes time. Although I will confess, it's promising, and I can say this having gone through the World Humanitarian Summit, and I myself personally felt the frustration for, again, having gone through like 3 years of consultations and a big summit with huge commitments, that there was just small progress made over the years. But I am encouraged to see, just in the matter of the past 9 months, some of the fundamental changes that are already happening and already taking place as a result of the UN, but also INGOs. As an example, we all know about the 11 clusters and 4 areas of responsibility. Now they've been reduced to 8 clusters, and you will be pleasantly surprised, without telling you a lot about what's happening behind the scenes, in terms of the negotiations that are happening amongst UN agencies and NGOs regarding cluster lead arrangements. This is like giving up, power and potential resources by saying, you know what, in one particular cluster, without mentioning which one it is, there were 4 agencies competing for 2 positions. And it was so promising to see a couple of agencies saying, you know what, we're going to stand down. We are happy with this UN agency or non-UN partner to co-lead this particular cluster. So it's a very different environment. It is promising. And then we come back to the point around INGOs, and this is also the voice of local NGOs saying, we're concerned because you're channeling more funds via international NGOs to us. The INGOs are the intermediaries, and there's a lot of costs associated with channeling funds through international NGOs, and they themselves are also heavy. And so it's just important that, I think, in this exercise, to be, to value each other's contributions, be ruthless in terms of really stating where the comparative advantages lie, and being careful also about, to your point, around not derailing the progress that we've made in the past, because at the moment there is that risk, because organizations are competing for funds, and part of it is concerns that some of the funds may go to local NGOs at the expense of other organizations, international organizations. We got to make sure that we have these honest conversations to preserve the progress, not only preserve the progress, but to make sure that we push them beyond what we've been able to do at the moment. So thank you.
Thank you. Reshma, do you want to, in a minute, respond, or I'll move?
I think it's probably good to move on, but I will just say that this system requires everybody, right? I am. Despite what I say, I'm a firm believer in multilateralism, and I think the UN needs to continue. However, and I think that there's a lot of howevers in general, I'm not sure that I would be as excited about the way that, for example, cluster co-leads are determined and look at that as a marker of change. For me, that is less motivating and more depressing, because it is such a small thing that you would think we would be beyond it by now. And I understand that it takes a lot of time and effort to have these discussions, having been part of them. But you look at the state of the world today, and you look at the level of need out there, and I'm just not in a position to be celebrating the small wins anymore. I think we have to go big. Because there are people who need us to be big. They need us to change, and that has to be our priority. But we're not on opposite sides, at all. still a bit more of a fighter right now. So small wins, and I want big ones. Let's go.
Thank you. And speaking of transformative change, then ECHO is one of the largest donors of humanitarian action today. You know, it used to be US, now it's EU and its member states. And ECHO at the same time has been part of the funding structure on which the current system all these years have relied upon. The current reset is led by the same power holders. So what's in your toolbox and your intention to can you push for this transformative change that Reshma mentioned?
No, I think that is indeed an important question, and I just want to very quickly react upon the exchange before I get caught in the middle of all of this. No, but I mean, obviously we're extremely grateful for the leadership and the drive that Tom and his colleagues and your colleagues are bringing to this, and we think it is very important to see that there is a genuine willingness to change. Whether the genuine willingness is sufficiently shared by all actors within the UN system and the wider sort of humanitarian community is debatable, and I think we see pockets of resistance here and there. But very clearly, we need, all of us, we need to own that change, we need to drive forward that change, and we need to become a force behind this. And you will not be able to do it alone. The INGOs and the NGOs generally have a crucial role to play. They have to speak up. I also very much agree with the point you were making earlier that you can do whatever you want, but if the donors don't create the incentives to go in that direction, it will remain teary. So involve us also very much, as you're doing already to some extent, but I think we really collectively at all levels, from UN to INGOs to donors, we need to switch into crisis mode, and I agree there is change taking place, there are hopeful, positive signs, but perhaps not yet at the speed and the scale that we all need to see. I think to your question, sort of how can we sort of try and influence and help shape this? I think let me take the example of efficiency in the work, where I think we have very clearly come to the conclusion that the humanitarian system as it exists is far too fragmented, everybody working on their own, which simply doesn't allow for economies of scale. And that is a pity, because in a context where there's not enough funding to meet all of the needs, we need to make sure that every euro or every US dollar is used with maximum impact, sort of. So one very important area where we see the need for change is on the humanitarian supply chain, which is one of the 30 elements in your roadmap, sort of, but for us it's a very important one and a very crucial one. And it's an area where DG ECHO has been spearheading efforts, where we've really been trying to promote change over the last few years. And I think it is really here an example of a case where a donor is basically driving the whole humanitarian system to rethink its approaches to this. And why is that so important? The supply chain, it might sound like a technical operational thing to many of you. It's actually, my argument would be that the supply chain is the most strategic thing you have to do in the whole humanitarian community. According to our data, the costs of the humanitarian supply chain account for between 60 and 80% of the total cost of humanitarian aid funding. And that is, of course, if you take supply chain in the broad sense, going from procurement of items to warehousing, transporting them, distributing them, last mile delivery, etc., etc. So if you look at the supply chain in the broad sense, then it's around 60 to 80% of the total cost. If that were the case in any private company, that you have such a high cost in one particular area, that would make it an issue to be discussed in every single management board. It would be at the strategic level up until the point where it is fully optimized. If you look at very competitive sectors like the retail sector in Europe, where companies are fighting bitter, fierce fights with each other, one thing they have all come to realize that is if we are just fragmented and not joined up on logistics, we all lose. So big supermarket chains will be competing enormously with each other, but they will work together on logistics, on distribution, and they will not do these things themselves anymore because it doesn't make sense that all of these different actors invest in these systems themselves. So we want to see a much more strategic approach to the supply chain. We need to have more joined up approaches to this. It doesn't make sense that everybody is buying their own products, buying their own, going on the market, competing with each other. We need to join up and really team up on this and make sure that we exploit these economies of scale. We can have much more leverage on the market and we can reduce costs significantly by doing that. So we have been organizing a series of workshops with all of the humanitarian partners. This is now culminating into a big high-level event on the 10th of December in Brussels, where we will basically want to see the whole humanitarian community, but also the donors signing up to this. And I think we as a donor will want to see these more joined up approaches in the future, and we will incentivize that through our funding. And we're very, very happy to see that the idea has been picked up in the context of UN80 and the reset. And there is now this proposal that is being worked on where WFP, UNICEF, and DOS would work together on a more integrated supply chain. We also think that offers enormous opportunities for INGOs, and we really hope that this will be the way forward. Supply chain is just one example of this, but the whole area of shared services is extremely important, and we have an extensive field presence as a donor. We have 400 people around the globe working closely with the humanitarian partners. So we also try to encourage the humanitarian partners to better share these services. I will just give you one very quick example. When cross-border assistance from Chad to Sudan became possible, the whole international humanitarian community landed in Adre, a place that nobody had heard of before, and where there was very little infrastructure available. Everybody comes with their own machinery, their own structures, their own warehousing, everybody recruiting local drivers, bringing in their own fleet, their own communication systems. We had colleagues present there who basically banged some heads on the table and said, this cannot be the case. This is an incredible duplication of effort. We need to join this up. And I'm very happy to see that today the approach is completely different. There is real change in places like Adre, and there is a much more collaborative effort. And again, very happy to see that these things are picked up in the research. There's many other things, perhaps just because I also want to look at what we need to do better. I think as donors, there is also important work to be done. I mean, we need to move away from the short-term funding. I fully recognize the difficulties associated with that. We are trying to do more multi-year funding. We're developing these programmatic partnerships, etc., with some of you. But it is also not easy on our side. I fully recognize that. And the last point I want to mention, where the cooperation between donors and partners is going to be super important, is the famous nexus and the whole approach to fragility. In this crisis moment, I think there is a new opportunity to have another go at the nexus and to really try and make it work. Many preach the nexus, few do the nexus, and we're not the best students ourselves, but we are making efforts, and I think there are good examples now where we are trying to bring the humanitarian development peace nexus together and make sure that we have a longer-term approach to these things where we can generate real impact and real change. Thank you.
Thank you, and speaking of funding specifically, then the hyper-prioritized needs which came out earlier this year showed the extent to which the system needed to shrink and also make trade-offs, essentially deciding from, I don't know, capitals or local level, in one case one, the other case the other, who to help and who essentially to leave behind. So it's kind of a life and death decisions that we are then forced to make. Are we actually well placed to make these decisions? Or how does it also go into the funding, going more to pooled funds and local actors? So what are the plans of from the UN side with the country-based pooled funds in that respect?
Yes. So so for colleagues and here and eventually also like online. So for 2025, we had targeted to assist and protect 181 million people, and the dollar ask was $56 billion. And as a result of the significant funding cuts, we've had to make some very, very tough decisions as the IASC, so to target, instead of 181 million, 114 million people with a dollar ask of $29 billion. And at the moment today, we are a little over 18% funded, even after hyper-prioritization. So that really puts us in a really terrible situation. So the question is, are we best placed to make decisions? Absolutely not. I mean, these cuts have put us into made us confront two serious dilemmas. One dilemma is an ethical one, because we've had to make choices to decide who to support, who to assist, and who not to assist. So it doesn't mean that the needs have gone down. So 79 million, so from 181 to 114, 79 million people, we've had to make a decision that these are not the priority communities that we will be able to support. That's a serious ethical question, not just for the system, but for the broader ecosystem. How can we be placed in the situation where we have to make these impossible decisions? The second dilemma is really more on the structural side, which is, again, building on your point around the need to do more on the nexus. And we've talked about the nexus for many years,
decades.
For many decades, and we haven't been able to make the break that we need to make on the nexus discussions. So in a lot of the contexts where we talk about nexus, even as we transition, and as a result of these cuts, we are already looking at transitioning out of 8 contexts out of the 28. And so I'm hoping that the reset is going to catalyze, well, come on, development actors, we need you to be there. Come on, IFIs, we need you to step in. But we're struggling. We're really struggling to, get the development funding and attention in these extremely fragile contexts, which are usually contexts that many development actors and IFIs are challenged to operate in. So there's a missing link. So as a result, there will be a serious governance void if we don't push for these. To address this, the absence of development actors and development funding in many of these contexts. So no, it's not an easy situation to be in. And as I've mentioned, even after this hyper-prioritization, only 20% is funded. So expect more communities beyond the 79 million that will not be receiving life-saving assistance and protection. That's a serious, situation. So with the pooled funds ultimately in the big scheme of things, I mean, I'm talking about the OCHA managed pool funds. If we're lucky between the Central Emergency Response Fund and the country-based pooled funds, if we're lucky, next year, maybe we'll have $900 million that will be raised for both types of funds. But when we're talking about $900 million out of an ask of $29 billion, that's really not serious. It's not, I mean, of course, it's an important contribution, but it's not going to cut it. So there is, of course, the push or the drive and the interest to channel more funds to country-based pool funds, because again, it allows decisions to get closer to the operational level. So you have the humanitarian coordinator, the humanitarian country team with the local representation, the advisory boards of the country-based pool funds that are made up of local representatives, UN and INGOs, to determine at the operational level what are the needs, how do you close the supply between the gap between supply and demand, and cut a lot of the overhead costs by ensuring that, again, it goes as directly as possible to local actors. For the country-based pool funds in particular, again, I know the word success is a big word to use in today's environment, but just to give you a sense, the emergency relief coordinator, Tom Fletcher, set the target that for that pooled funds, the OCHA managed pool funds, 70% of it will go to local actors. At the moment, we've hit the 50% mark, so 50% of the OCHA managed pool funds are going to local actors. But also, to be honest, we have to also unpack this. How much of it is direct? How much of it is indirect? And there's a lot that we need to do to make sure that we channel more of these funds directly to local NGOs. So countries like Mozambique and Venezuela, 100% of the country-based pool funds go to local actors. In Somalia and Myanmar and Ethiopia and Nigeria, over 80% of country-based pool funds goes to local actors. But we need to make sure that, again, these are not default or exceptional good examples, that these have to be the standard across the board, and that's where, again, the scorecard is going to really be quite important. Mm-hmm. Last word I'm going to say around efficiencies, if I may, as well. So, and I hear you around the supply chain and, and the striking figures of 60 to 80% going through supply chain. And that will ultimately, take us to the point or the question of what are communities asking for and what are we supplying, right? Because, and I suspect that the 60 or the 80% of the supplies, I'm hoping the bulk of which are vaccines and medical, which is understandable. But if it's beyond that, I a plea, and given the fact that you're also driving these changes, to really look at what are we purchasing. Because if communities are saying we need more cash, not food, are we ready, as member states and as donors, to catalyze and scale up cash so that we purchase less of, again, and I'm not just saying food, it's many other things beyond the medical. And so I think there is definitely space for more efficiencies there as well.
And we will come to cash in a minute as well. But before that, Reshma, question to you. How has the NGO sector, your 185 members and beyond that, coped, and how are they doing the life and death decisions, essentially, on the ground?
Maybe just first to highlight that of the 185 members that ICVA has, more than 65% of them are local and national NGOs. So ICVA most certainly doesn't represent the INGOs as a singular body. I think that's, well, one, that's an impossible task. We also can't really claim to represent all NGOs. But I think the other thing that is important is we are starting to see a massive increase in refugee-led organizations and women-led organizations at the local and national levels that are seeking to become members of ICVA. And that is because they're really seeing the space to be able to raise their voices and to have an impact and to have input into these broader global policy discussions. So just to get back to your question, across our 185 members, the picture is uneven in terms of how they're coping with the funding reductions, but also in terms of making these decisions. I will say that, you know, hyper-prioritization, we go through these cycles. It's something that I think as, you know, as the NGO sector has evolved, there are these constant moments where you're prioritizing certain responses over others because of funding. So again, you know, it's not new. I think that the concept of hyper-prioritizing and cutting out such a significant number of people to serve feels startling right now, and it is. And, you know, you cut out serving these populations, it doesn't mean their needs disappear. It doesn't mean these populations disappear. They're still there. And I think that is probably the hardest thing for local and national actors in particular. The reality is this is a moment that is testing the resilience and the imagination of civil society as a whole. Many organizations have scaled back or focused on fewer contexts. Many are adapting in smarter and more collaborative ways. We're seeing NGOs share auditors, finance teams, compliance services across networks and consortia. I would say that at this moment, NGOs are engaging in deliberate acts of redesign and not desperation. And that, for me, is motivating, right? This idea that we didn't hide, we did bury our heads in the sand. I mean, there were a lot of tears shed for sure, but I think in general, there is this sense of this is our reality, and so how do we change in order to serve the most number of people possible with what we have left? I just want to say that you know, efficiency is about smarter cooperation, in my perspective. If we start talking about efficiency from the point of austerity, then I think we've lost the goal. There is always going to be space to be more efficient. There is always going to be space to be more effective. And I think if we pretend like that is not something we have been trying to achieve as NGOs for the last decades, then we've lost the point of what we're trying to achieve here. So I think that NGOs will survive this contraction. I think they will change their modalities. I'm hoping it will allow local and national NGOs to be not just directly funded, but empowered to lead in decision-making, which I think is the most critical space where we have not succeeded as an international community. And I hope that will, in turn, allow for more creativity in how we engage with communities and how we respond to their needs and, as Mervat said, their demands.
Thank you. And from Hans, I asked previously what levers do you have in order to influence the change of the structures. But at the same time, you are funding responses. You are funding not only the organizations, but your HIPs are there to fund specific crises. So you are also leading the way in deciding where to give how much money. So how do you do these difficult choices?
Yeah, it's tricky, and many important things have been said already. I think for the time being, we have stability in our funding levels. So we have the same level of funding of around 2 billion euro for next year and for the year after. And then after that, we will have the new multi-annual financial framework in the EU. And there, the budgetary negotiations are still ongoing, but the Commission has proposed actually an increase in humanitarian aid funding up to 25 billion euros, which is significant. So in that sense, we are a little bit spared from strong prioritization ourselves. But of course, the 2 billion that we can provide at this moment in time has a completely different significance today than it had a few years ago, because the rest of the donor community has significantly reduced its levels. So we are looking very carefully at how we can now best, on the one hand, support the system as a whole, We're trying to put some focus on enabling functions. There's a number of things around data collection, needs assessment, but also logistics, humanitarian air services, etc., that benefit not just one or two partners, but benefit the community at large. And we're trying to make sure that these functions can survive and can remain intact. And then we're trying to look smartly at how we can pick out partners that can fill gaps that have been left by others, try to have responses that are well informed and that can have a catalyst effect on many different areas. I mentioned it in my introduction, but I just want to mention it again, the incredible importance of credible and professional and good needs assessments. I think also there is a need for more collaboration across the whole humanitarian community, better data collection, better interoperability of data, better sharing of data, better data analysis also. But at the end of the day, very clearly, despite all of the efforts we are making, the EU will not be able to fill the gaps that have been created by others. So there will be some scaling back. It is inevitable. It will be brutal in some places. And I think the only thing we can try and hope for and work towards is an orderly transition, so that we have a process where indeed other actors, like development actors, take part of their responsibility and try and help us to develop these nexus approaches. Super difficult. Development has its own set of challenges at this moment in time, obviously. But I think we all have to work and work towards responsible and sustainable transitions.
Thank you. And before we go to questions, do get your questions already ready. Let's talk a bit about cash, and if we have time, then localization as well. Estonian Refugee Council, we are in emergency situations, we are cash-first organization because cash is fast, it's cost-efficient, it supports local markets rather than bypasses them, and most importantly, I think it's dignified. It gives people choice, it trusts them. Also, the supply chains are considerably shorter and less expensive when it comes to cash. And at the same time, within the framework of Reset, also Tom Fletcher said cash first, local first, and cash first. So why are we seeing a steady decline of cash assistance, even though the promises in the framework of Grand Bargain already 10 years ago promised cash as the default option? And Reset now gives the same promise. So can we see a bounce back from the trend down right now? Maybe let's start actually from Hans again.
Should I?
Yep.
Yep, very good. No, listen, very happy that we have the opportunity to speak about cash, because as a donor, we are deeply convinced that cash, multipurpose cash and voucher assistance is the smart thing to do wherever it is possible, of course, and there is an assessment needed, which can only be context specific, in which cases it is possible. But wherever it is feasible, we think cash and voucher-based systems are much better. It's about restoring choice. It's about restoring dignity. It's about supporting local economies. And it's also just simply more efficient. The data that we have suggests that cash-based systems are around 40% more efficient than in-kind assistance. So we have a long-standing commitment to try and promote cash. We have a policy around this in place for many years. And we are putting our money where our mouth is. If I looked up the figures since 2022, we have spent around 2 billion euro in cash assistance. That is around 23.5% of the total funding we have provided since then. The global trend is exactly the opposite. There is very clearly a downward trend. What we see is that in 23-24, the total amount of cash-based assistance went from roughly 24% down to 19.6%. And for this year, the figures I have seen are absolutely appalling because we're around 10% globally, which is a trend that we very much regret. It's not a trend that, I mean, it is really developments outside the European Union. It's not us. But we're very keen on trying to reverse that trend because this will determine, to a large extent, how efficient and effective the international humanitarian system as a whole can be. So we really have an interest in making sure that cash is used wherever it's feasible. So you can expect us to give a little push in that direction wherever we can. We also have this common donor approach on cash, which is, I think, the way to go. It's an approach which is by now supported by many of the big donors and where we believe there is some traction and will basically encourage everybody to move in that direction. So the final sort of message on that, I think, is make sure we get good proposals on cash. I mean, we're very serious and very sincere in our approach to this. We see sometimes partners favoring in-kind approaches rather than cash approaches. And so it is not just something that donors are not sufficiently supporting, but it's not yet the default option that we all start from. And I think that's what we need to work towards. Now, I'm also the first one to recognize that in some contexts, it doesn't work. And in some contexts, the option is still not there. But I think there needs to be more discussion about where further progress is possible on this. Thank you.
Thank you. And essentially the same question to Mervat.
Yeah.
What is the place of cash in the reset? Because efficiency is there, the gains are there.
Yes, I mean, to echo what you've both already said, it is absolutely the most efficient and dignified way to provide assistance, but also with the caveat that not everything can be solved by cash. So other than context-specific, whether cash is feasible or not based on whether it's allowed in certain contexts, whether the infrastructure exists or not, but there's also some assistance that is not possible through cash. And here I'm talking about protection, here I'm talking about gender-based violence, here I'm talking about, of course, the provision of various health services. Here I'm talking about some specific context. As an example, maybe in Gaza, when, again, the purchasing power doesn't exist yet, when markets don't exist yet, when supply routes are not open yet. So 100% cash should be the default, but also bearing in mind that there are specific things where you require other forms of support. But again, these should be the exceptions, in my view. These should be more the exceptions than the rule. Many of you may have read the CALP report that says that if we move to 50% cash assistance without raising any more money, we would be able to assist 2.7 million additional people. 2.7 additional million people. So again, it's something for us to reflect on as a system, as different actors, including member states and donors, which is, even if we're not able to mobilize additional resources, is there political will amongst donors and to shift their decisions from in-kind and other forms of assistance to multi-purpose cash? That's the question, and that's the push, and that's the advocacy that needs to be put in place or needs to really be scaled to make sure that we're able to use every taxpayer's euro or dollar or any other currency as efficiently as possible to reach many more people than we are at the moment.
Thank you. And to switch now gears a bit towards localization, then to Reshma, I would ask what kind of changes do we need to actually have the local voices heard, both in the reset, but I mean actual leadership on the global level changes, as well as continuous management of both the pooled funds, but also the response itself.
Yeah.
How can we make this as local as possible and as international as necessary?
Well, if I had a full answer to that, I'd be famous by now.
Not millionaire, but
no, I think it's a really good segue between cash and localization, because I don't think that cash without a commitment to localization is achievable. So I don't know a way to increase the level of cash in a context in terms of response without making sure that you are prioritizing local leadership, local decision-making, local engagement in understanding and evaluating needs. So, I think we can all acknowledge, to some degree, localization has been discussed for nearly a decade, if not more. But that progress is still, generously, I'll say, uneven in terms of how it's gone. And I think where you see the overlap between cash and localization is, in general, we've mistaken presence for power as an international community, right? Because for cash, in a lot of different types of modalities, and obviously I would agree with Mervat, there are certain types of response modalities that cash is just not the way forward. But in the places where it is the way forward, you don't need as many international actors on the ground. You don't need as many international agencies on the ground. You perhaps can be looking at different modalities also in the UN system. And so this is where we are sort of competing against ourselves, and why I say, presence is power, and that's how we've defined the future of the system in a lot of ways. Real localization is about shifting decision-making power and not just about delivering your programs. It's about predictability. It's about multi-year funding. It's about risk coverage for national actors where very, very little exists. It's about, not making reporting requirements absolutely impossible to achieve without some form of massive infrastructure in place. So, I think ultimately locally led leadership is the goal, not localization as a sense, because I think that's too easy to define in deliverables. So we partner with a local NGO, and so we are as local as possible. Well, are you handing over decision-making? Are you handing over engagement? Are you handing over needs assessments? Are you handing over program development and program design? The answer to that is very limited, right? And so true localization will only come from shifting to an idea of local leadership. And I think that we need to be redefining local leadership through the lens of efficiency, because we know that efficiency gains are real at the local level. We've seen them work. We've seen them be successful. We have loads of communities where international actors have not been present for a variety of reasons, and I think your third panel will probably get into that quite well in terms of access. I've worked in countries where national actors are the ones who have access, and international actors are sitting in the capitals because there is no capacity, there's no opportunities for international actors to be in these places. So I think we have to reframe the way we look at localization, and we need to reprioritize the concept of leadership and local leadership, and understand that that's not going to look like how we want it to look. And it's us that needs to change. It's the system that needs to change, not local actors, because that's an easy default as well.
Thank you. And now we will switch to your questions from the audience. I know there are some posted online on Slido as well, but if the askers are in the room, then the mic is there, so please do raise your hand in order to ask the question yourself, if you want to, of course.
Hi. Do you hear me? Yeah.
Thank you so much. I really appreciated the focus on needs assessment and understanding expressed needs, not assumed needs, and also your emphasis on communities and yours on data analysis, on needs assessments. My question is, the emphasis is very welcome, but sometimes I feel that funding for these specific activities is very limited or remains an afterthought. So how can we actually do explicit research or assessments when money isn't really earmarked for that? Thank you.
Thank you, and let's take one more if there is one in the audience, please.
Hi, thank you so much. My question is also around needs. We were mentioning the hyper-prioritization in terms of the number of people that we can reach, given the reduction in funding. But as well, there's discussion around the nexus, and there's discussion about what the expressed needs are, including livelihoods, including education, which to set people and communities on the pathway to self-reliance and resilience. How does that sit with a reduction of funding which has tended to lead to a prioritization of immediately life-saving activities? Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Let's take then, let's start with Mervat.
Sure. So maybe just starting with the last question, it's a very hard question to answer. It doesn't sit well at all. But in the end, we have to make difficult decisions based on the funds that we receive. In an ideal case scenario, I mean, either actually multiple things, an ideal case scenario. First is we would have cracked the nexus conversation decades ago because we have started it. But I feel that with the nexus conversation, it's two, in a simplified way, two entities that speak very, very different languages, and we're just speaking across each other. So humanitarians are designed and built to be there in crisis settings and will be the first to be there to help. Development actors are more risk averse, and in addition to this, also development actors naturally and rightly so have to work via governments. And in some parts of the world, in many parts of the world where humanitarians work, governments or are parties to the conflict, are the reason why there are IDPs in certain contexts. You see, of course, what's happening in Sudan, what's happening in Gaza, what's happening in many other contexts. So there is a fundamental disconnect. We're not able to find that right common ground, which is how do we find these intersections where humanitarian and development actors can indeed work better together. There is progress again, and again, call me naively optimistic, but I always look at, again, the silver lining and everything, and there is some progress happening, and I can speak about some of the great examples with ODA funding from the World Bank and the great collaboration with UNHCR in refugee settings, with WFP. So you see them, happening. But again, they need to be happening at scale. And on your first question, absolutely, I think, and that's where I think also with the reset, because through the humanitarian reset, we're also talking about the need to engage, and I'm purposefully saying this in every single intervention. It's not just engaging with donors. I always say engaging with member states and donors, because we do need to broaden the support of constituents beyond the quote-unquote traditional donors, because it is the traditional donors that are funding the current pillars of the system, including needs assessment. And as you find the traditional donors dwindling in terms of the finances provided, as a result, some of these critical areas, with the exception, of course, of the EU, with needs assessment and supply chain and common services and others, it's also dwindling. So how can we also make the case for other member states beyond the traditional donors to step in and support these critical pillars of the system? How can we do more in terms of engaging with the private sector? Because there's a lot in the world of the private sector, and I've had, again, the privilege through the World Humanitarian Summit to strike some amazing partnerships with the private sector that are ready and eager to come in with their capacities, with their resources, with their in-kind contribution, whether it's around AI or IM or data, to help the system as part of the corporate social responsibility, but also beyond. So there's a lot more that I think we can definitely explore there. Yeah.
Thank you. Hans, please.
Sure, very briefly, and I think I agree with everything you just said, but very briefly to add to it, if the result of all of this is that in a couple of years we're entirely focused on food and health, then we have missed the opportunity. I think it's what we're really hoping for, and it's the best we can hope for at this moment in time, is that through the reset there will be a real transformative impact, and that we can really reform the system as a whole so that it becomes lighter, more lean, cheaper, and that we can have more impact through lesser resources, and that transformative change should free up the space to continue to invest in more than just life-saving. But these are really difficult questions also for a donor. We have an internal discussion on education in emergencies, which has been one of our flagships. I mean, we've always been very proud to invest a lot in education in emergencies, which we think is actually life-saving to a large extent. I mean, it is about quality of life at least, and it's about making sure that we don't lose entire generations of children. But can you still afford that in a context where the money you're spending on education in emergencies is not being spent on life-saving activities in other parts of the world? Difficult questions, but I think the answer needs to be found by making the system as a whole more agile, and really trying to become more efficient with the funding that we have, and you can very much count on ECHO to try and support the UN and the NGOs in that respect. Needs assessment, we are making a very conscious, deliberate, strategic choice to focus on these enabling functions. We have stepped up a little bit. It's not big money, but we have increased a little bit the money for things like data collection and data systems and needs assessment, and we will continue to do that, and we will continue to encourage others to follow that. The system cannot, whatever shape or form it takes in the future, data and needs assessment will always be key. So we really need to make sure that we become more robust in these things. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, both really, really good questions. I'm not going to repeat what my colleagues up here have said. I will say that I think Mervat's optimism and silver lining is seeping over this way. So that's one success of today, right? Now, look, the reality is we're facing shrinking budgets, we're facing increasing politicization, and we're facing unrealistic expectations about what the humanitarian community writ large, right, including the UN, including donors, including NGOs, what we can deliver. And there is a little bit of pragmatism that we need to also be embodying as we have these discussions, right? It's important to remember that compromise is going to be inevitable. It's going to be inevitable. And I wish I could say something different up here, but I just can't. Hopefully, our principles is what will keep our pragmatism from turning into a bit of a drift, right, and from taking us too far down the path. But, as NGOs, we have to be operationally flexible and ethically steadfast. We have to remember what we're doing and why we're doing it, but we have to remain flexible in order to respond to the environment as it shifts around us. NGOs, I think, in general, are actually, I'll change that phrasing. The humanitarian community in general is working under extraordinary strain. And it doesn't matter where in the system you're placed. You know, it's the one thing that I think is universally true from everybody that I've spoken with in the last 9 months, right? Whether you are a donor, whether you are in the UN, whether you are in an NGO, regardless of where you stand, it has been a hell of a year. A hell of a year, right? And we can't pretend otherwise. And mostly it's been a hell of a year because we see the dramatic amount of need out there. I mean, I say that and every single one of you will have a context or a community or a conflict in your mind where you think, yeah, we need to do more. More has to be done. And that is what we live with every single day. So I'm going to end with saying perhaps something that Mervat maybe would say is that hope doesn't come from optimism, from my perspective. It comes from persistence. And it is the one thing that has kept me in this sector for more than 20 years, is persistence. I genuinely believe these kinds of conversations, this kind of gathering, bringing people together to have conversations about what is the future of humanitarian action, making sure we include local and national NGOs, making sure we include communities, is the way forward. So yes, we're slow, and it drives me mental, but I would rather be slow and inclusive than fast and divisive. So I'll leave it there.
So you do agree with Mervat at the end of the day?
At the end of the day, yes. I mean, we're on the same side, right? Ultimately, we're on exactly the same side. And if we don't challenge each other, then we're not here for the right reasons. I think we're all about what is the best way to serve populations, and not so much about, you know, what our title is or what organization we work for, because we do what we do for populations in need. I mean, we've spent time in these countries, we've engaged with communities, we've worked with local partners because we see value in responding to populations in crisis. And that is what this is about. So hopefully that'll make you all realize I'm not just a pessimistic NGO person sitting on the stage, but you know, we do it because we love it, and we do it because we believe in it.
Although we could even end with these words, then I do want to make one final lightning round. You know, in management and coaching, etc., you have this method where you think about your life, and then you have a 3 categories in which you put things you should be starting doing, keeping doing, and stopping doing. So in a minute for each of you, then do say in 5 years' time, or whatever the time frame you imagine, what is the one thing we need to start doing, keep doing, and stop doing. So whoever is ready first can go.
I'm happy to I'll think and talk at the same time. So I would hope, other than the start, keep, and stop, I would hope that in 5 years' time, and again, that's the being naively optimistic, or again, and never, for me and the way I operate, and I hope that most humanitarians, I'm sure most humanitarians operate in the same ways, that you have to be aspirational, because if you're not aspirational, you risk settling for the mediocre or the lowest common denominator. So I'll always, and I must say I'm pleasantly surprised that despite a couple of decades in the system, I haven't lost that level of optimism and that need to be aspirational, because I'm sure, because of, again, the sector that we're in, that what drives us, as you've mentioned, Reshma, is you know, it's our good intentions and good deeds. You know, it's we're not doing it for profit or bottom line revenue. We're doing it because our bottom line is we want to reduce suffering and reduce the loss of life. So in that spirit of optimism and being aspirational, I would really hope in 5 years, and I want to believe it's going to happen, that although we are very scrutinous of the humanitarian sector, and we have to be scrutinous because, as I've mentioned earlier, what's at stake is really, really high, it's lives, that the other pillars of the system and the community around ending conflict, preventing conflict, really pick up the pace, because it is as a result of that we as humanitarians step in and deal with the symptoms or the consequences of the failure in mediation and prevention efforts. I would hope also in 5 years, from now, that we'll crack the nexus conversation and we'll see more development actors and IFIs present in many of the protracted crises. I would hope that also in 5 years' time that more and more governments are going to take up their responsibilities to respond to the needs of their populations. And so what we should start, keep, and stop. Start being more humble as a system, because I think we need to be a lot more humble and recognizing the tremendous capacities and the abilities of local actors at the ground level. They're already doing tremendous amounts of work, even without resources, and that's a fact. That's what we should start doing more of. What we should keep is, I think, more of that spirit of, collaboration and doing a lot on the advocacy side. And I think this is something that we need to do. We're doing more, I think, even more recently, especially with the advocacy. I think we're braver in terms of the advocacy that around IHL violations, but we also should do more around the humanitarian diplomacy for access and protection. And what we should stop doing is competing.
Thank you. Please.
Shall I continue? No, thank you very much. And again, I think Mervat basically said pretty much all of it. I think what we need to keep at all costs is that that drive, the values and the principles for which we work on a daily basis, and when you read that in European Commission documents, it sounds like blah, blah. But when you then go in the field and you go to places like Myanmar, or I was in the east of DRC earlier this year, I was in Ukraine, and if you go to these places, you actually see what these values and principles mean for people. And I think we should never, ever lose sight of that. It is so incredibly important, and so many people basically survive with that little bit of hope, that there is care and understanding of their situations. And I realize I haven't said much about localization, and I just want to use one sentence on this, because again, in Myanmar, I met with local partners who are risking their lives on a daily basis to cross checkpoints, to cross lines, to smuggle a backpack of medicines in a bus. We're really talking about things like this. And most of the work they do in humanitarian terms is actually illegal. If they get caught doing it, they will get arrested. So, it is incredibly difficult and challenging, the work that some of them are doing, and that is why, as a donor, we have now stepped up our commitment on localization. We have now introduced a target. I'm not a fan of these targets because it complicates my life enormously, but we have introduced a target that by 2027 we want to have 25% of our funding to local actors as directly as possible. We cannot do it immediate, but we do want to limit the number of intermediaries to just one. So basically, there is a commitment there, and there's real work to do. So I think what we should keep it all means is the pride and the belief in the principles, the values. What we need to do better is basically to make the whole system more lean, more agile, more flexible. I think you said a very important thing a few minutes ago. not every organization needs to be in every theater. We need to divide. We need to really make sure that you have one or two really good, capable partners in one area, and they just have to get on with it and get it done. And we need to think much more in team approaches. I mean, it has to be the UN and the international NGO community acting as one, each on their own added value, their own comparative advantages that they can bring to this. What we need to stop doing is I think we need to there's a lot of value in humbleness, and I think it is important to be humble. At the same time, we are perhaps not always sufficiently clear, and we don't talk enough about the impact that we are generating. I think we should tell our story much better. I honestly believe that among the EU population, and probably around the whole Western population, there is a lot of support for this type of work, but we need to bring that story better to the taxpayers. We need to make sure that individual citizens understand that this is about doing the right thing from a moral point of view, but it is also in everybody's interest that we get this right and that we help communities in need. It makes the world a safer place for everybody. Thank you.
Thank you. And final words, Reshma.
Great, you gave the pessimist the final words. I had lots of time to think, so that's good. So I think we need to keep a system that is connected, trusted, and honest about its limits. And we need to keep advocating and keep calling out IHL violations and attacks on humanitarians and humanitarianism. We can never, ever allow ourselves to be silent about that. So that, for me, is by far the most important thing to keep. I think we need to stop being entrenched in the binaries that we've created in the sector, that humanitarian development, and I know I'll get pushback on that, but the donor implementer, the local national, the local international, the national international, the regional international, whatever. I mean, we need to stop being entrenched in these binaries as if that is what identifies us and our humanitarianism. I think we need to really sort of push ourselves towards a people-centered ecosystem when we're talking about international humanitarian response. And then I will say I think we need to start using the reset as to design a complementary system, a system where local actors are leading, and they're leading confidently, and they're leading in a way that is supported and empowered, that international agencies are using leverage and diplomacy responsibly, and that donors are seeing accountability as a shared investment. So I will leave it there. That wasn't so pessimistic.
Thank you, and a round of applause to our panelists. So we hopefully then in 5 years' time, when we reconvene, hopefully the same group of people here on the stage, we will have a leaner, more efficient, and in all means a better response and ability to do that locally as much as possible, cash as much as possible, and of course dignity first at the end of the day.